Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking, well, a massive leap. We're spanning something like 2.6 million years of human history, and we're exploring a practice that sits right at the intersection of language, ritual law, and, yeah, modern global politics, halal dietary
It
requirements.
really does touch on all those areas.
Our sources for this deep dive are pretty expansive. We've got material from specific Arabic jurisprudence, the mechanics of animal slaughter. Then there's analysis of ancient anthropological evidence, looking at the origins of humans eating meat. Plus, sociological studies on why it's sometimes controversial today, especially in the West. And of course, comparative texts looking at halal alongside Jewish kashrut.
It's a rich mix of perspectives.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to get a quick but, deep understanding of the core concepts. Dab, that's slaughter, and halal, meaning lawful. And we want to analyze how these practices, which are millennia old, are navigating the challenges of the 21st century. Okay, let's unpack this. We should probably start where all the legal scholarship does, right? With the specific terminology in the Quran, specifically that foundational word, dubiha. Dubiho from Surah Al-Maida.
Yes, dubiya. And what's fascinating right away is how the nuance of this Arabic verb really defines the entire legal practice that follows. Dabaha is the root verb, and it literally means to slaughter. It's very physical. It describes the specific action of, well, slitting the throat, cutting the jugular veins, the esophagus, and the windpipe. That's its literal core meaning. Undeniable.
Okay, literal meaning slaughtered. But often when we read translations, maybe in the context of religious festivals like Eid, we see dabiha translated as sacrificed. So if the physical act is basically the same, that throat cut, what actually separates just, everyday slaughter from a religious sacrifice.
That's the crucial distinction. It comes down to scope and intention. Well, what's known as niyya in Arabic. Slaughter, dab, is the general term. It's for preparing meat for consumption, kind of the everyday act. Sacrifice, nar, or qurbani is essentially dab, but performed with a specific, clearly articulated religious intention. The sources we looked at are very clear on this. The act only becomes a sacrifice when the intention, the niyya, is explicitly to draw nearer to God or, say, fulfill a religious vow. It's not just about getting food.
Right, the intention, the niyya. So if that's the main differentiator, how do certifying bodies or scholars actually draw the line between the mundane and the spiritual when they interpret the sources?
Well, they look for specific differentiating factors laid out in the jurisprudence. For instance, the primary purpose, general slaughter, is utilitarian, right? Getting food. Whereas the primary purpose of sacrifice is explicitly spiritual. It's worship. And then there's the occasion. General slaughter can happen any day a butcher needs meat. But a true sacrifice is usually restricted to specific times, like Eid al-Adha, or maybe a specific ritual like Akiyah.
Oh yeah, the aqiqah sacrifice after a child is born. That makes the distinction really clear. That's definitely a spiritual rite, not just getting dinner ready.
Okay, so basically all sacrifice is a type of halal slaughter, but not all halal slaughter counts as a sacrifice in that spiritual sense. That brings us neatly to the physical requirements. I think a lot of people assume that, the visible, maybe dramatic gushing blood is the main ritual point. But what did the sources say is the actual juristic objective here?
That is probably the most common misconception, yeah. The visible gushing blood isn't the goal itself. It's really just a consequence of doing the cut correctly. The key juristic objective, according to all the sources, is to ensure the maximum and complete drainage of blood from the carcass. That's the focus.
And why blood drainage? Why is that the absolute center point?
Because consuming flowing blood is explicitly forbidden. It's stated very clearly in the Quran, Surah Al-An'am, verse 145. It's considered impure. So by making that swift, deep cut, severing the four major pathways, the two jugulars, the windpipe, and the esophagus, the heart actually keeps beating for a short time, and it effectively pumps out most of the blood before the animal passes. This is seen as crucial for purity, and frankly, it's also a highly sanitary method from a pre-modern perspective.
Okay, so if that process is skipped, say the animal is killed by a blow to the head first, or electrocution that stops the heart before the cut, then the meat automatically becomes forbidden.
Exactly. That meat is then classified as meta, which simply means carrion or dead meat, and that's forbidden. The sources point to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who confirmed that the lawfulness of the meat comes from two things: the flow of blood and the mention of Allah's name. Unquote what? So this gives us those four main criteria for halal slaughter that you see consistently. 1, the slaughterer must be a sane Muslim, though some schools of thought also permit people of the book Christians or Jews. 2, the invocation. saying Bismillah Allahu Akbar. In the name of Allah, Allah is the greatest, right at the time of the cut. 3, the cut itself, swift, deep, severing those major vessels. And 4th, allowing the blood to drain out fully.
Got it. The 4 conditions are clear. Now let's pivot a bit to history. You mentioned people of the book. Given the pretty striking similarities between halal slaughter, and Jewish kosher slaughter, shechita, both forbid consuming blood, both forbid pork, both require that swift throat cut. How did the Islamic method actually develop? Was it borrowed or adapted from the Jewish tradition that existed before it?
Well, the sources definitely acknowledge the similarities. There's undeniable common ground there, and Islam frames itself theologically as the final culmination and refinement of the earlier Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, and Christianity. So fundamental principles like avoiding blood or the need for ethical treatment of the animal, these are seen as consistent threads running through those faiths.
Okay, so shared roots in Abrahamic principles.
Yes, but the sources are also quite firm in emphasizing that the specific details of the halal method were established through distinct revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, not simply adopted or copied. Where the paths really diverge is mainly in the, let's say, meticulousness of the practice and also the qualifications required of the person doing the slaughtering.
Okay, what are the biggest differences then between halal and kosher in practice?
The primary difference, and it's a significant one, lies in the rigor applied to the blade and the slaughterer themselves. In shechita, the knife used, called a tilaf, has to be incredibly sharp and absolutely flawless, perfectly smooth, no nicks at all. Even a tiny microscopic imperfection on the blade edge renders the animal treifa, which means non-kosher. The whole focus is on ensuring one single, perfect, theoretically painless cut. Now, halal requirements also insist on a sharp knife, explicitly to avoid torturing the animal, but the level of detailed scrutiny over the absolute perfection of the blade edge is generally less demanding than in kashrut.
Interesting. And what about the person performing the slaughter?
That's the second major difference. Shechita absolutely requires a shushay. This is a highly trained, certified, and often religiously observant professional who is authorized to perform the slaughter. It's a specific role. The sources note that for halal slaughter, generally speaking, any sane adult Muslim who understands the rules and makes the necessary invocation, Bismillah Allahu Akbar, can perform the dub. Some jurisprudence, as mentioned, extends this permission to Christians and Jews as well. It reflects perhaps a broader accessibility within the Islamic legal tradition compared to the more centralized authority structure required for kashrut.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's fast forward now quite a bit to the really complex and often politically charged landscape today. In many Western countries, halal certification, the practice itself, it often generates significant opposition, sometimes quite vocal. We need to look impartially at what the sources say about this. Why is this ancient practice often such a flashpoint now?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue. The sources we reviewed cite about 4 main reasons, and they often interlock. We should probably look at them separately, though. The first one, and it's the one most often debated publicly, is genuine concern over animal welfare. Specifically, it centers on the traditional practice of not stunning the animal before the throat cut. This practice clashes with many secular Western laws that mandate pre-slaughter stunning to minimize potential pain or distress.
Right, the stunning issue. But the sources also pointed out a really crucial nuance here, something that often gets lost in the public debate, doesn't it?
Exactly, and this is probably the key modern development to understand. While traditional halal practice often prohibited stunning, fearing it might kill the animal before the cut, the vast majority of major international halal certifying bodies today do permit reversible stunning. This means things like electrical head-only stunning or a specific type of captive bolt stunning that renders the animal unconscious but crucially doesn't kill it. Since the animal is technically still alive when the required cut is performed and the blood drains properly, many prominent Islamic scholars and halal authorities deem this compliant with those 4 main conditions of halal we talked about. This acceptance of reversible stunning directly addresses that primary animal welfare concern while still remaining ritually valid according to most interpretations.
Okay, so if that main welfare concern is being addressed by modern halal compliance standards, at least by many major certifiers, what's fueling the rest of the controversy?
Well, that's where you get into more sociological and political dynamics. The sources report that the opposition often seems to coalesce around a couple of other ideas. One is this notion you sometimes hear that halal certification is somehow an Islamic tax or represents an infiltration into mainstream food supply chains. This is often framed as an economic grievance, but the sources suggest it usually stems from a basic misunderstanding of how religious food certification, whether halal or kosher or organic for that matter, actually operates commercially.
And the other reason?
The second, and perhaps more potent driver, according to the sociological analyses, is that opposition sometimes functions as a form of proxy politics. When maybe anti-immigrant or anti-Islam sentiment is socially or politically difficult to express directly, criticizing halal practices can become a symbolic, more acceptable way to voice objections to multiculturalism or just the increased visibility of minority religious practices in the public square.
And this circles back to that observation some sources made. The seeming hypocrisy, where many opponents of halal consumption might simultaneously have no issue consuming, say, industrially farmed meat produced under conditions that could have objectively worse animal welfare standards than a properly executed halal slaughter, especially one with reversible stunning.
Exactly. It suggests, in some cases at least, that the application of ethical or welfare standards can be highly selective. It seems it's often easier for certain segments of the population to critique a foreign or minority religious practice, one that's maybe highly visible due to labeling, than it is to challenge a deeply entrenched, often faceless, industrial food system that they participate in daily.
Okay, to really anchor this whole discussion, we need to connect the ritual law all the way back to the deepest human needs. Let's shift gears dramatically now from modern politics to deep anthropology. We've been talking about the laws regulating meat consumption, but when did humans even start eating meat in the first place? How far back does this go?
Oh, we're talking about something incredibly ancient, an essential activity that predates our own species, Homo sapiens, by a vast margin. Scientifically speaking, we are omnivores. Our digestive systems, our teeth, our need for vitamin B12, which is hard to get from plants alone, it all points to a diet adapted for both plant and animal matter. And the anthropological evidence confirms that our ancestors, very early humans like Homo habilis and particularly Homo erectus, were actively processing animal carcasses for meat at least 2.6 million years ago.
Wow, 2.6 million years. What's the hard evidence for that specific, incredible timeline?
The evidence is pretty compelling. It lies in the simultaneous appearance in the archaeological record of two things: primitive, intentionally sharpened stone tools and animal bones from the same period that show specific cut marks made by those tools. These aren't just random scratches, they're clearly marks from butchering. They indicate our ancestors weren't just scavenging scraps left by predators. They were intentionally using sharp stone flakes to cut through hides, access meat, and maybe most crucially, break open bones to get at the rich, fatty marrow inside. Marrow is incredibly calorie-dense.
So accessing meat, and especially marrow, using tools to do it, that ability to consume and process animal matter was actually a key engine driving human evolution. It gave us the dense calories needed for, a bigger brain.
Precisely. That's the prevailing scientific consensus. The high-quality protein and fat from meat, especially marrow and organs, provided the concentrated energy load necessary to fuel the development and maintenance of a larger, more complex brain. The brain is a very energy-hungry organ. And this is where the theological perspective integrates that deep necessity. The Quran, for example, explicitly recognizes this human need for sustenance from animals. It views livestock not just as creatures, but as a blessing, made subservient to human needs, including for consumption. You see this in verses like Surah Al-Maida 23.21. But the sources emphasize, precisely because the consumption is so fundamental, so necessary, it must be regulated by clear, revealed ethical guidelines, which is the halal framework. The idea is to ensure respect for the life that is taken, and to ensure the purity and wholesomeness of the resulting food.
So it's a synthesis. Ancient human biological necessity dictated what we ate or needed to eat for our evolution. And then later, divine revelation, according to the Islamic perspective, dictated how we must carry out that essential act of taking life for food, codifying a method, the swift cut, the blood draining, that was seen as both sanitary and humane within that framework.
That's a good way to put it. You see the connection between the biological imperative and the ethical ritual regulation.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does it all mean? We started by just looking at one single Arabic word, dubiha. We recognized its dual meaning. It can be spiritual sacrifice or it can be general slaughter for food. We've mapped out its juristic rules, seeing how they center entirely on the intention behind the act and on the physical requirement for rapid, complete draining of blood. And we've analyzed how these ancient rules are actually still evolving, interacting with modern ethical concerns, like the widespread acceptance now of reversible stunning. While at the same time, the practice continues to face socio-political friction in some parts of the world.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is that the history of Islamic dietary law is deeply rooted in what it sees as distinct revelation. It builds upon shared Abrahamic principles, absolutely, but provides its own specific ethical framework. And this framework is designed to govern a practice eating meat that has literally powered human evolution for millions of years. So it exists today in this really complex, ongoing dialogue between ancient concepts of ritual purity, modern concerns about animal welfare, and the often turbulent dynamics of multicultural societies.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over, drawing from everything we've discussed. Considering that proper halal slaughter, with its intense focus on the rapid and complete draining of blood primarily for reasons of ritual purity and hygiene according to the tradition, and knowing that accessing meat, those dense calories, was so essential for early human brain development, how might the specific principles embedded in these ancient dietary laws, particularly that mandate for a rapid, complete bleed out, potentially inform or even challenge modern industrial farming and slaughter practices today? Could they, perhaps paradoxically to some, offer a baseline for thinking about better hygiene or even more humane standards on a global industrial scale? That's a complex and maybe provocative question, something to think about until our next deep dive.